What dietary changes did you make, Dr. Gundry, to have such a profound change in your lipid profile?
Well, and I won't, as an undergraduate at Yale back in the dark ages, we were allowed to design our own major, a course of study for 4 years where, if we were lucky, we just worked with a bunch of full professors. And I was chosen to do this. It was basically like doing a master's in college. And you had to have a thesis, and your 4 years of study was to defend your thesis, write a thesis. And my thesis was that you could take a great ape, manipulate its food supply and manipulate its environment, and prove that you would arrive at a human being. That was my thesis. And I defended my thesis and actually got an honors and gave it to my parents, and went away and became a very famous heart surgeon and never kind of thought about it again. So when I met this gentleman who I call Big Ed, who dramatically reversed inoperable coronary artery disease, inoperable blockages in his coronary arteries in 6 months' time by changing his diet and going to a health food store and taking a bunch of supplements. When I asked him to describe the diet that he had adapted, I stopped him a few sentences in and said, wait a minute, that's my thesis and in college. And, wow. And when I asked to see all the supplements he was taking, I am very famous for protecting hearts from dying during heart transplant and during heart surgery. And I had a concoction that I would put down the veins and arteries of hearts to protect these hearts, the cells. And a lot of the stuff that I was putting in my cocktail to protect the heart from dying, he was swallowing. And, never occurred to me to swallow them. So long story short, my parents sent me my thesis, and I was a big fat guy. I weighed 228 pounds, even though I was running 30 miles a week, going to the gym 1 hour every day. I was a very large version of Peter Attia. I was a Clydesdale runner. And I was eating a very healthy, low-fat diet because I was professor at Loma Linda University, a blue zone. And that, of course, is healthy for you. So I basically got rid of my low-fat, healthy high carbohydrate diet and began to eat as if, long story short, it was winter, and I began to eat a large amount of leaves, and I stopped eating fruit, and I started taking a bunch of supplements that I got from Costco or Trader Joe's or health food stores. And I lost 50 pounds my first year. My lipids flipped in 3 months. And I lost subsequently another 20 pounds, and I've kept it off now for 25 years. When I started doing this with my patients who I operated on, we started to see the same things. People's diabetes would reverse. People's arthritis would reverse. People's blood pressure, would plummet. They call and say, hey, what kind of supplement are you giving me that my blood pressure is going down? And I'm going, there's no supplement that does this. Come on here, let's check. And sure enough, their blood pressure was a lot lower. And we go, well, let's back off on, this drug. This went on for about a year at Loma Linda. And I had really an epiphany one morning that I was going into work, and I said, I got this all wrong. Instead of operating on people and then teaching them how to eat so they'll avoid me in the future, because quite honestly, I was very famous for reoperations. Every 5-7 years, you'd redo what you did. Mm-hmm. And that I thought there must be a better way. So I resigned my position.
Wow.
I said, I need to teach people how to eat, and then I'll never have to operate on them again. And that's really stupid for a heart surgeon, as my wife reminded me year after year. You can't make much money teaching people how to eat. But because I am and was a researcher, when I set up my clinic, I just said, hey, I want to ask you to take away certain foods. I want you to add certain foods. I want you to go to a health food store, buy some supplements. I want to measure blood work on you every 3 months. And if you want to play, you're my research project, and you'll learn something, I'll learn something. And that's how it all started.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It is a really, it's very invigorating to hear that you were very successful. You were in the prime of your career. You were doing certain things, and then an empowered patient. And I've heard you tell that story before, and I believe that actually you didn't advise him to make these changes. He made these changes off his own accord and persuaded you to rescan him and redo tests where you saw the reversed coronary artery disease, which is really quite profound because it's still not conventional wisdom that we can reverse established atherosclerotic cardiac disease. Whereas you and the other doctors as well are talking about this through changes in our lifestyle. You mentioned yourself, you ate as if it was winter. You cut out all fruit. You put more greens into your diet. But what else did you do? I mean, what about meat, fish, protein, these sort of things? Because people will want to know, okay, Dr. Gundry, that sounds incredible. What did you do back then? Or I guess the more pertinent question is, Dr. Gundry, how long ago was that? And although it was successful, what you did, if you were doing it now, would you make any modifications to the diet that you chose back then?
Yes. And that's, again, maybe when we started our conversation, thankfully, because of my patients, I'm able to see, okay, this tweak works, this tweak doesn't work, or it doesn't have much of an effect. And one of the chapters in the new book is called The Plant Paradox 2.0. So it's kind of, all right, what have I learned from, the Bible since it came out? And so one of the things, maybe we'll dive into that part. Loma Linda is a Seventh-day Adventist institution, and Seventh-day Adventists, as a general rule, are vegetarians, and a lot of them are vegans. Those who do eat animals certainly use dairy products and eggs. A lot of them eat fish and chicken if they're going to. So I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and Nebraska is called the beef state for a reason, because of its very heavily beef-eating, beef-producing area of the United States. So I have no dog in the fight of is animal protein good or bad for you, but one of the things that I've, I guess, learned, and so I made my changes when I was 45 years old. I'll turn 73 in a month. And, so far so good. And it's one of the things that I've seen from my patients, that I've seen certainly from myself, is there's a fascinating two problems. Number one, whole grain goodness, as we call it in the United States. The reintroduction of whole grains into our diet has really only come in the last 60, 50 years. Before, a great number of cultures have labored to take the outside part of grains away. Believe it or not, why do the French not eat whole grain croissants? Why do the Italians not eat whole grain pasta? Why do 4 billion people in the world who eat rice eat white rice and throw the brown away? People have, and it's a lot of work to take the hull off. Even interesting corn. Traditionally, corn was soaked in lye or lime to remove the hull, and it became hominy. And then that flour was ground up to make masa flour. And it's fascinating that there are really nasty plant defense proteins in the hull of virtually all grains, except sorghum and millet, which doesn't have a hull. And that's been a lot of what's made me infamous or famous. But cultures have always tried to get this hull off. Even cultures that don't take the hull off. The Incas did not de-hull quinoa, but the Incas fermented their quinoa. And the quinoa fermentation, interestingly enough, breaks down lectins. Bean soaking, all cultures that use beans soak their beans. And it turns out that beans have bacteria on the surface of the bean that during soaking ferments the lectins on the surface of the bean. And that's all that foam that you see coming out in a pot of beans when you're soaking them. That is the fermentation of those beans. And unfortunately, the champions of beans and grains don't bother to tell anybody that cultures have always figured out a way of detoxifying these plant compounds before they eat them. And it's to our detriment that we don't, keep those cultural traditions alive, getting back to what you and I just started about.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And for me, as I hear that, I think about the importance of taking this wider, more nuanced perspective on health. So, for example, if you look at something just through the lens of blood sugar, right? How much is this food going to elevate my blood sugar? You may well go, well, actually, instead of white rice, I'm going to have brown rice, right? Even though it doesn't always transpire that way, some studies have shown. But you may go down that route. But a lot of people struggle with digestion with brown rice. They don't feel good afterwards. They don't like the taste often of it. And certainly for me, my parents are Indian. I'm in an Indian family. I'm Indian by heritage and backgrounds. White rice is a big part of the diet I grew up eating. And what wearing a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, has taught me, one of the things it's taught me is that I can still eat white rice, but I don't need to have a big bowl of it, a big plate of it, just a little bit. And I can enjoy it. It can be a nice accompaniment with something else I'm eating. And my blood sugar is relatively stable. So I've learned about quantity being quite important. But if you just look at it through the lens of blood sugar, you may say, no, you can't have these things. So I think that's really interesting. So getting back to that original point, Stephen, if you don't mind expanding. So 28 years ago, when you made those changes, were you bringing in whole grains then as well? What were you doing? And then how would that change now based upon the new things that you've learned?
So, no, I actually took whole grains out of my diet. And it's funny, my first book was called Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution, and it came out in 2006. And my editor at the time, I had totally gotten rid of whole grains. It was kind of an Atkins with a lot of leaves diet, I guess you could say. And
so meat and fish in it as well at the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct. And so that was kind of phase one of diet. So when you're writing diet books, editors love phases. It's just something they do. And so phase two, once you got things under control, we introduced healthy whole grains and soy. And, I argued with her. I said, no, this has no place in it. She said, you don't understand nutrition books. The party line is, you have to reintroduce, whole grains because everybody knows that whole grains are, really important. I said, yeah, but you're missing the point. No, these are bad for you. And she said, you don't understand. You signed the contract. We own your book. And if you don't want to go with this, then, have a nice day and goodbye. And you don't get to publish the book. No, really? And they said, yeah, really. So that's in that book. And so the second time around, when the Plant Paradox came out, HarperCollins bought the book. And I said, look, there's going to be things in here that you guys are not going to like that goes against conventional wisdom. And I'm sorry, but it's non-negotiable. And they said, oh no, we love this stuff. This is crazy. And it's controversial. And it was and is. But so, yeah, we got rid of all these things initially.
Yeah, really interesting. So I want to get to the controversy about that book because I think it's really interesting to sort of unpick what was controversial and actually what your view is on that today. Before we do that, though, just to finish off whole grains, you mentioned that you've been studying the blue zones a lot. There is a view that actually in some of these more traditional cultures, let's say the blue zones, that they will eat whole grains or they'll have breads with their meals and they'll have, traditionally made breads that maybe are fermenting 12, 16 hours, quite low gluten containing by the time that we eat them, as opposed to a lot of the breads in the UK and certainly in America, which are very, very quick turnover. Is it true? Do these guys have whole grains in their diets? And how does that then fit with what you just said about whole grains?
Yeah, and I've alluded to this in other books, but I go deep into it in the next book. What's fascinating about the blue zones, and I've spoken with Dan Butner, and he's a nice guy, and Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel had a verse: "A man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest." And when you look through the eyes of someone who is primarily a vegetarian, and you are looking for places to back up your view, then you don't see the other parts. So now I say this because I'm sorry, the only nutritionist who spent most of his life, career, in one of the blue zones, Loma Linda, California, the only blue zone in the United States. And just so we're clear, blue zones have nothing to do with ocean or anything like that. Blue zones actually refer to the fact that there was a meeting in Montpellier, France, where, and I won't mention the doctor's name, who was actually had no interest in nutrition and longevity back. He got out a map and he took a blue felt tip marker and he circled places that he thought had exceptional longevity. And it was the blue felt tip marker that was actually where the word blue zones came from. So since that time, let's take a couple of examples that I use in the book. Sardinia. So Sardinia is, quote, a blue zone, and not so fast. There are two major areas in Sardinia, people who live down by the water, the coast, and people who live in the mountainous region. There's very good papers that I allude to, cite that only the people up in the mountains have extended longevity. The people who live down by the water don't. The people who live down by the water, primarily fish eaters. The people who live up in the mountains are sheep herders. And fascinatingly, only the men in the mountainous region have the exceptional longevity. The women don't. They have no different longevity than any place else in Italy. And it's the men who have the longevity. And 85% of the men smoke, only 25% of the women smoke. And we can have fun with that all you want. The Nagoyan Peninsula in Costa Rica, yes, lots of people eat corn and beans. There's a wonderful paper that I cite showing that the corn and beans are a negative aspect of that diet that's compensated for by the fact that these people in this peninsula are sheep herders, and they eat a lot of sheep yogurt and sheep cheeses. And so it's actually, so far, 2 of the blue zones are sheep herders. The Crete, Kari are sheep herders. They eat a lot of sheep yogurt and cheeses. They also have a fascinating plant called purslane, and everybody has actually seen purslane. It's a weed that is in every sidewalk crack wherever I've lived in the world. It's a pretty flower called moss rose or portulaca. But purslane is loaded with a short chain omega-3 fat called alpha linolenic acid, ALA. And it was the basis of this purslane that the famous Lyon heart diet trial was founded. Anyhow, so now we got 3 of the 5 blue zones that are sheep herders. Oh, by the way, all the men smoke dramatically. At Chiaroli, south of Naples, that I visited, more centenarians than any place in the world. The men are big-time smokers. They're sheep and goat herders. And they eat a ton of rosemary, but we can get into that when you want to. Loma Linda. One of the things that shocked me when I was recruited to come to Loma Linda is their diet is 50% fat, primarily dairy fat. Yogurts, cheeses, butters. They also use a ton of mayonnaise. And I used to argue with the dietitians that they were killing my patients with this high-fat diet. And they go, excuse me, we're some of the longest living people in the world. Go away. We know what we're doing. And I go, but this, you're killing my patients. True. That's a true story. So tons of dairy in these blue zones. Now, the final blue zone, Okinawa. The Okinawans are unique in that they can't grow rice in Okinawa. And back in the 1600s, they luckily were able to import a purple sweet potato from China that actually thrived in Okinawa. And 85% of their diet is a purple sweet potato. They don't eat beans. They ferment their soy. They use natto and miso, but they don't eat soy. They don't eat tofu. And rice is just a tiny, tiny fraction of their diet. Now, the other thing that's unique about the Okinawans, in the rest of Japan, they are called the spice eaters, because the Okinawan diet has a huge amount of incredibly spicy, bitter vegetables, greens that they use and nobody else in, Japan uses. So they're nicknamed the spice eaters. So I'm sorry. If we're going to be honest, we should call the blue zones white zones.
If you enjoyed that clip, here's another powerful clip that I think you are really going to enjoy.